Some horror films are inspired by real events, but the reality behind them is rarely what we see on screen. Behind the films were young women whose suffering was misunderstood, families living with fear inside their own homes, and victims whose stories are often forgotten. From the Exorcism of Emily Rose to the real cases behind the Conjuring films, this video explores the people behind 5 well-known horror movies inspired by real events. Stay until the end to discover the real stories behind them. Anneliese Michel was 23 years old when she died. She grew up in Bavaria, in a deeply religious Catholic family, a sensitive, quiet young woman who wanted to study and live a normal life. At 16, her health began to change. Blackouts, convulsions, trance-like states. Doctors diagnosed temporal lobe epilepsy and prescribed medication. But treatment brought little relief and no answers that felt meaningful to her or her family. Fear slowly replaced understanding. Raised in an environment shaped by devotion, guilt, and the idea of atonement, Anneliese began to believe her illness had a spiritual cause. She heard voices while praying. She believed she was damned. Her parents began to believe it too. Between 1975 and 1976, Anneliese underwent 67 exorcisms over nearly 10 months. The rituals lasted hours. She was often restrained. She knelt so repeatedly that her knees were severely injured. She gradually stopped eating. By the end, her body was exhausted. She weighed around 30 kilograms. At 23 years old, Anneliese Michel died of malnutrition and dehydration. After her death, medical experts testified that she had not been possessed but suffered from severe mental illness influenced by epilepsy, fear, and isolation. Her parents and the 2 priests were charged with negligent homicide. They defended their actions, believing there had been no other way. "I don't regret it," her mother later said. "There was no other way." Years later, her story inspired The Exorcism of Emily Rose. But her story did not stand alone. She was not the first person to die during exorcism rituals, and not the last. History shows us something difficult. When suffering is misunderstood, human voices can be lost quietly and repeatedly. But not all horror stories begin with belief. Some begin with silence. Born in 1906 in rural Wisconsin, Ed Gein lived on an isolated farm with his parents and older brother. His world was small and ruled by one voice, his mother. She was deeply religious, controlling, and fearful of the outside world. She taught Ed that women were sinful, corrupt, and dangerous, except for one, herself. Ed was shy, mocked by classmates, and emotionally dependent on his mother. She discouraged friendships, she rejected any sign of independence, and she remained the center of his life until her death in 1945. When she died, Ed was left alone for the first time, and something in him collapsed. Years later, 2 women disappeared from the same small town. Mary Hogan ran a small tavern in Plainfield, a place where neighbors gathered and knew her by name. She disappeared in 1954, leaving the town unsettled. Her body was never fully recovered. In 1957, Bernice Warden, a hardware store owner and mother, failed to return home after opening her shop that morning. Her disappearance led police directly to Ed Gein's farm. What they found there shocked even experienced investigators. Inside the house were objects made from human remains, bowls made from skulls, lampshades made from skin, furniture covered in flesh masks fashioned from faces. But these were not trophies, they were attempts. The women Ed killed shared physical similarities with his mother, middle-aged, strong-featured, authoritative. According to investigators and later psychologists, Ed's goal was not domination or violence for pleasure. It was transformation. He wanted to become his mother, to wear her, to bring her back. Ed Gein was arrested and declared mentally incompetent to stand trial. He spent the rest of his life in psychiatric institutions, where he died in 1984. Only 2 confirmed victims were ever attributed to him. Yet his name became something else entirely. Ed Gein inspired Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Silence of the Lambs, Ed Gein, The Butcher of Plainfield, and Monster, the Ed Gein story. His crimes were exaggerated, his story reshaped, his image turned into horror entertainment. Meanwhile, the women he killed were reduced to footnotes. This is the unsettling truth behind many true crime stories. The more monstrous the killer becomes, the more invisible the victims are. Ed Gein became a legend, but Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden were real people, with lives, routines, and futures that ended quietly. Remembering the past means remembering who was lost, not just who frightened us. Ed Gein's crimes shattered the idea of home, and horror cinema began to move from killers to houses. In 1971, the Perron family moved into a farmhouse in Rhode Island. Roger and Carolyn Perron and their 5 daughters. At first, it felt like a new start, but small things began to feel wrong. Objects moved, clocks stopped, strange smells filled the house. Carolyn began to change. She woke unable to move. She felt watched. She felt the house did not want her there. The family later learned the property had a long history of deaths and local legends, including stories about Bathsheba Sherman. Historians dispute many of these claims, but fear doesn't need proof to grow. The Warrens eventually investigated the house. Unlike the film, there was no dramatic exorcism. The Perrons stayed for years unable to leave, living with fear as part of daily life. The house still stands today. If the Perron story remained mostly private, the Enfield case unfolded in front of the world. In 1977, the Hodgson family lived in a small council house in Enfield, North London. Peggy Hodgson was raising 4 children alone. Life was already difficult. Financial stress, responsibility, exhaustion. Then strange events began. Knocking sounds inside the walls, furniture moving across the floor, toys thrown across rooms. At the center of everything was Janet Hodgson, an 11-year-old girl. Neighbors reported seeing chairs move on their own. Police officer Carolyn Heaps visited the home to investigate, and she later claimed that she saw a chair sliding across the floor on its own. Soon, journalists arrived. Investigators from the Society for Psychical Research documented the case for months. Despite witnesses who reported seeing furniture move and objects fly across rooms, skepticism grew alongside belief. Years later, Janet Hodgson admitted that she and her siblings had staged a small number of incidents, about 2%, as she described it in interviews, including bending spoons and making knocking sounds to mislead investigators. Some researchers later concluded the case was largely a hoax, arguing the children may have been reacting to stress, attention, and the unusual situation surrounding their home. But not everyone agreed. Investigators Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair, who spent months documenting the events, maintained that many incidents could not be explained by trickery alone. Objects appeared to move without contact. Furniture shifted across the floor. Voices were recorded that did not sound like a child's. The debate never fully ended. Years later, in 2016, Janet and her sister Margaret returned to the house on Green Street for the first time in decades. Janet described the experience as very strange. She remembered the chest of drawers moving across the room and the constant feeling of being watched. Even after nearly 40 years, the memories had not disappeared. Whether paranormal or psychological, The experience stayed with the family long after the events themselves ended. The third Conjuring story moves away from houses entirely. It begins with a child. In 1980, 11-year-old David Glatzel began showing disturbing behavior after moving into a new home in Connecticut. His family believed he was possessed. They contacted Ed and Lorraine Warren. An exorcism was performed. During the ritual, a young man named Arne Cheyenne Johnson, the boyfriend of David's sister, claimed he challenged the demon to enter him instead. Months later, in 1981, Arne Johnson killed his landlord Alan Bono during an argument. The case quickly became national news. Johnson's defense team attempted something unprecedented. They argued that he was possessed. The court refused to allow the defense. Medical experts testified. Witnesses described Johnson's behavior before the killing. The jury ultimately convicted him of manslaughter. He served several years in prison. Unlike the haunted houses of the earlier films, this story unfolded in courtrooms and hospitals. What remained afterward was not proof of possession, but a difficult question. How do belief, fear, and influence shape responsibility? Especially when a child stands at the center of the story. Behind films watched by millions are often real tragedies and the darker sides of human nature. Cinema turns fear into something we can face safely from a distance, but the lives behind these stories were never fiction.